This podcast is on Granger Causality. This is a bit of an exotic topic, but it's a nice extension of regression analysis that can come in handy when you would like a statistical answer to the question of what causes what. Now, the photo on this slide is not one of myself, but one of the inventor of Granger Causality, Professor Clive Granger. Granger Causality was developed by Professor Granger, and he won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2003 for discoveries like this. It's a deceptively simple idea. We can establish Granger causality when past values of an independent variable x significantly explain a dependent variable y, controlling for past values of y. And that, in a nutshell, is really all that is involved with Granger causality. Now, some of the reasoning behind Granger causality is useful to know. Granger causality uses something called lagged dependent variables in a time series data set. So, as an example, the lagged value of gross national product per capita in the United States would be last year's measure of gross national product per capita in the United States. So when we say a value is lagged, it's lagged by one time period. That could be quarterly data if we're talking about economics, or annual data if we're talking about economics or democracy. But that's what is meant by lagged variables. So Granger causality uses a lagged dependent variable. In other words, on the right-hand side of the equation, we find the measure of the dependent variable from the previous time period. Now that is a very powerful explanatory factor if we're trying to account for variation in the dependent variable. After all, the best understanding of what a measurement at time t might be would be for that variable's measure at time t minus 1. For instance, democracy is relatively slow to change in countries around the world. So the best understanding for what democracy is like today in France is to look at last year's democracy score for France. It'll probably be extremely similar. So in this environment, it's rather difficult to imagine that a lagged independent variable, x sub t minus 1, would break through that very challenging explanatory barrier of that lagged dependent variable. In other words, the Granger causality test is a very conservative test, and it's biased toward accepting the null hypothesis of no causal relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, because we have the lagged values of that dependent variable in the regression model. Now, when I lecture on this particular topic, I like to use a quotidian or prosaic example to talk about Granger causality. So my example here will be breakfast. Now, not everyone's like me, but there probably are a lot of people who are like me in that we tend to eat relatively the same thing for breakfast day after day after day. And I happen to like an egg sunny side up on a piece of toast. Easy to make, easy to digest, and I don't have to think about it anymore. Well, that's a rut that one can get into, kind of a habit, if you will, so that the best explanation of what I will have for breakfast tomorrow is what I had for breakfast today. And then the best explanation of what I had for breakfast today would be what I had for breakfast the previous day, and so on and so forth. So that's a concept of the lagged dependent variable from trying to explain what I have for breakfast each day. Now, what about an intervening variable? Well, here's an intervention, especially in pre-pandemic days and hopefully post-pandemic days very soon, we'll often have family come to visit. And when family come to visit, sometimes we like to go out for breakfast. And then, I'm not going to be a stick in the mud, I'll change up what it is I'll have for breakfast. And that'll be an intervention, if you will, kind of an independent, lagged intervention that will change my behavior at breakfast. So we can see this in an equation format. What I have for breakfast each day is a function of what I normally have for breakfast each day, and any significant interventions such as family coming to visit. So we could say that the family visit, Granger causes changes in my breakfast eating habits. Okay, that's enough about my breakfast. I've got some examples of Granger causality. There are quite a few in the literature, and I'll choose 3 just to exemplify what is meant by Granger causality. Professor Hamilton, in the Journal of Political Economy in 1983, published a piece where he examined changes in GNP, gross national product. And he found that even controlling for previous values of gross national product, dramatic changes in the price of oil, or oil shocks, cause declines in gross national product. So he applied Granger causality to note that even with the rather inertial effect of the global economy year after year after year, that oil shocks can break through and have a causal impact on gross national product. So that's one example of Granger causality. Second example is an article I wrote with Mike Lewis-Beck some time ago, where we attempted to see whether or not there was a causal relationship between the level of economic development in a country and its democratic performance. So we took measures of economic development, in this case energy consumption per capita, and measures of democracy, a measure put forth by the democracy tracking non-governmental organization Freedom House. And we performed Granger causality tests. First, we performed a regression where we had current values of democracy as the dependent variable, immediate past values of democracy as an independent variable, and immediate past values of energy consumption per capita. And we found through this regression modeling that indeed economic development Granger-caused democracy above and beyond the previous year's score for that country on democracy. But we did not find that democracy Granger-caused economic development. So we found one-way causality taking place. Economic development Granger causes democracy in countries around the world. Third example, more lighthearted example, comes from Thurman and Fisher, published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics in 1988. And Thurman and Fisher wanted to know which came first, the chicken or the egg. Or in other words, what's the causal factor here? So they collected data on egg production in the United States from the mid-30s until the mid-80s. And they collected data on chicken production in the United States from the mid-30s to the mid-80s. And they performed Granger causality tests. They took chicken production as the dependent variable, and then as the independent variables, the immediate past, the previous year's value for chicken production, the lag dependent variable, and then previous year's egg production. And they reversed that, and they, as the dependent variable, used egg production in the current year, and independent variables, egg production in the previous year, and chicken production in the previous year. And after doing the Granger causality tests, they found that eggs Granger cause chickens, but that chickens do not Granger cause eggs. In other words, egg production significantly explained variation in chicken production, but chicken production did not significantly explain variation in egg production. So this is purely a statistical test of causality, and it involves, of course, using lagged variables. In other words, the independent variable has to be from the previous time period in order to affect the dependent variable of the current time period. So we're able to answer a kind of a philosophical conundrum: which came first, the chicken or the egg? It seems like the egg here comes first. Okay, well, that is it for the course material in POLS 398. Thank you for sticking with me throughout the course. I certainly hope that you have learned a lot about regression analysis and its applications in many different ways. Here's a photo from Cape Blanco State Park in Oregon, along the Oregon coast. Almost the most westernmost point in the lower 48 states of the United States. And this is a very pretty day in early June. And you can just imagine the loudness of the waves crashing on shore along the Oregon coast. Be at peace. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you for sticking with this course throughout the semester.